Our next speaker, whom we're going to jump to a little bit early, Bill Galston from the Brookings Institution, who alerted me that because of the Jewish holiday needs to be home before sundown, and so he needs to be out of this room by 10 minutes till 5. So we're going to start with his presentation. Providence, a Journal of Christianity, American Foreign Policy, does not want to imperil anybody's soul, and we believe in religious freedom. So when Bill finishes speaking at 10 till 5, please don't block his way as he makes his way out into the hallway. But hopefully we'll have some time for questions and comments formally before he has to leave. So Bill, we really appreciate your ability to join us, and we are confident that you'll be synthesizing everything that's been expressed here over the next 20 minutes. In effect, he already has with a wonderful article that he published in American Interest called The 12 Theses of Nationalism, which I commend to you. Thank you, Bill.
Well, yes, it's true. You know, I'm the final leg of Will Herberg's famous three-legged stool, and as such, I have certain obligations this evening that I dare not shirk. So I will have to talk and run, for which I apologize. So that's my first introductory note. My second introductory comment is that it's always interesting to reflect when a topic bursts into public view and comes to dominate public discussion. Why? Why now? It's sort of a meta question. Why nationalism now? And my opening gesture towards an answer to that question would be to say, and I think previous speakers have said something to this effect already, that nationalism is not only an affirmative term, it's also an oppositional term. And I think in the current context, the discussion of nationalism stands opposed, on the one hand, to the discourse of internationalism and also cosmopolitanism that the proponents of nationalism think has gone too far and has unbalanced the discussion against the nation state as what is, as the basic building block of the kind of international community that exists, and on the other hand, against tribalism and identity politics. And there's a long tradition in the United States going back at least a century of worrying about identity that is less than national identity, that is hyphenated, to use Theodore Roosevelt's term. And so I think these two worries are in the air and are helping to provide the context for the nationalism debate. My third comment will be, opening comment will be ad hominem, but I don't intend it to be a cheap shot. It's a genuine puzzle. I know both Yoram Hazony and Patrick Deneen. Indeed, I've debated both of them. I've read their books with great care. And if I ask myself, what is the single most important common element, of those two, of their two best-known books and their way of thinking, it is deep antipathy to John Locke and the liberal tradition of which he is an important source. Now, that raises, and I mean this as a genuine puzzle, what is the relationship between deep antipathy to John Locke and a genuinely American nationalism? In order to put those two things together, do you have to read John Locke out of American identity, certainly out of American creedal identity? Some people are trying to do it, but I would say to that, lots of luck, right? You will be going against the testimony of the founders. And so it is an interesting approach to American nationalism that begins by denying one of the principal sources of American nationalism. Maybe it's a circle that can be squared, but I'm glad somebody else will be making the effort. Now, I want to advance in these brief remarks just a couple of theses. I guess thesis number one, put into the context of today's discussion, is that the distinction between creedal identity and cultural identity, between creedal nationalism and cultural nationalism, may be too stark, particularly for us as Americans. And let me try to explain. I think most of the people in this room could probably recite by heart, or pretty close, the famous second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if people abroad know anything about the Declaration of Independence, they know that. I'm astonished by the relative neglect of the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, which begins famously, when in the course of human events becomes necessary for a people, and then goes on to talk about dissolving the political bands that connect that people with another people. And then when you get to the end of the famous second paragraph, you find the right of the people to act politically and collectively, to alter or abolish the form of government they've inherited, maybe even the form of government they made, but it didn't work out so well, and to institute others. Okay, so we have this huge red flag right at the beginning of our founding document. We have an undefined term, a people. What does that mean? Well, one of the founders, indeed one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, the least well-known, and one of the few papers he contributed, John Jay, in Federalist number 2, a paper, by the way, that's probably been more discussed in the past 5 years than in the previous 150. Here's how John Jay answers the question that the Declaration of Independence does not answer. Here's what he said. Jay talks about one united people. That's the hypothesis, right? He says, Providence has given one united people for one united continent. In effect, one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, and who, by their joint counsels, arms, and efforts, fighting side by side throughout a long and bloody war, have nobly established general liberty and independence. Now, if I had a lot of time, I would break down that list into its components and ask to what extent, in contemporary America, that definition of one united people is still satisfied. Indeed, some historian friends of mine have argued very persuasively that it wasn't true, even when Jay said it, but it is certainly not true now. Are we descended from the same ancestors? No. Do we profess the same religion? Certainly not. Are we very similar in our manners and customs? No. Have we fought a great war together to establish our independence? No. A couple of the conditions are still satisfied. We speak the same language, mostly. We're attached to the same principles of government, mostly. But that's about as far as Jay's definition gets in the contemporary context. So if we speak of one united people, we can't do the full J anymore. So what can we do? Well, as was noted just a few minutes ago, I published a piece in the American Interest, which is also available without a paywall on the Brookings website, called 12 Theses on Nationalism. And I reflected on a number of what I regarded as failed definitions of a nation. And I came up for myself with something that's pretty close to what Paul Miller put on the table in a previous panel. And here is my definition. A nation is a community united by sentiments of loyalty and mutual concern that shares a cultural heritage and the belief in a common destiny. So by that definition, I think Yoram Hazony, if he were in this room, would be reassured by definition, because the Jewish people, and one of the linchpins of my argument is that people and nation, as I'm formulating it, are basically coextensive terms. A nation is a community of people that fulfills the criteria that I just listed. That certainly Jews are a nation in that sense, and you could view Jews for 2,000 years as a nation in search of a state, and Zionism as the effort to restore the Jewish nation to statehood. The opening line of the Israeli Declaration of Independence speaks of Israel as, and I quote, as the nation state of the Jewish people. It could not be clearer. Another example of a nation that fulfills the criterion of one united people/nation, also in search of a state, is the Kurds. If there is any nation on earth that deserves a state of its own, it's the Kurds, right? And and I don't think it's bad nationalism to say that. I think it's self-evidently true. And has a number of other virtues, promotes a number of other human goods as well, even though I can think of some realist objections, to Kurdish nation statehood. So but it doesn't stop there. The idea of this common cultural heritage as part of the definition of a nation. If I had picked one bone with Walter Russell Mead this afternoon, and experience has taught me that that's often a risky business, I would have said that American nationalism includes a dimension of cultural heritage that embraces a specific political norm. Let me call that specific political norm liberal constitutional democracy. Okay? And my contention is that when the Pledge of Allegiance talks about "and to the republic for which it stands," republic is not just this diffuse res publica. The republic for which it stands is, in fact, one version of liberal constitutional democracy. How do I know that? I know that from the Constitution. Where in the Constitution? Article 4, Section 4, where the national government guarantees to each and every state, and I quote, a republican form of government. And what that guarantee includes is exactly that triadic political ideal that I just put on the table of liberal constitutional democracy. So the republic to which we pledge our allegiance, and which is part of America's, the shared culture that makes up the American nation, is not neutral, is not politically neutral. It's not just allegiance to any old republic defined as res publica in any old sense. It's an allegiance to the particular kind of political community, call it a regime, if you will, that we have. Here's the second. So that's the first point I wanted to make. You begin with the American creed as defined by the Declaration of Independence and appropriated by Abraham Lincoln and so many others, and you are led by the internal logic of that creed through the definition of a people as morally fundamental, you are led to a form of culturalism and a form of particularism. The theory is inert unless you bring that second element. Think of it as a practical syllogism where, the second paragraph, constitutes the major premise, but the first paragraph is the minor premise, and only then do you get the conclusion of the United States of America. Okay, here's the second point I want to make very briefly. And this came up, I think, in a very useful way in the previous panel, and to some extent even in the panel before that. Nationalism involves a measure of collective self-preference. There's no way around that. And what I want to argue is that collective self-preference is legitimate, but only up to a point. In the same way, and a question from the floor anticipated the move that I was about to make, that all particularist loyalties are natural and right up to a point, starting with family loyalties. So, here are some favorite examples of mine, philosophers' examples to motivate the conversation. There's a you're on the beach with your family. There's a riptide that pulls two children out too far. One of them is your child, the other is somebody else's child. Are you obligated to flip a coin if you think you only have the strength and the time to save one? Are you obligated to flip a coin? I would argue that a moral code that answers that question in the affirmative is humanly monstrous. It's not a moral code that I could support, and I think there are good reasons for that. Okay? That is a clear case of tragic but legitimate particularist preference. Okay? Here's another example in the same vein. You're walking along the beach with your child. A riptide pulls someone else's child out to sea. And meanwhile, your child stubs his toe, cries out to you, for comfort, kiss me, daddy, kiss me, mommy. And you realize that if you attend to the emotional well-being of your stub-toed child, that you may very well imperil the life of the child who's been taken out to sea by this riptide. There is a clear case where preference for your child would be a clear moral mistake. Now, how do you know that? And here is where, as an Aristotelian in my youth, I'm happy to join forces with Catholic social thought and say, by comparing the nature of the goods at stake, you can discern without a lot of discernment, that one trumps the other. Okay, now, this raises the question outside the family realm, but in the international realm, how much sacrifice is a particular nation required to make for the good or well-being of the people of other nations? Now, let me tell you what the two extremes of this argument are. One is global utilitarianism, of the sort advocated by the Princeton philosopher, who I suspect is not a great favorite in this room, Peter Singer. And the utilitarian proposition is everybody to count for one, nobody to count for more than one. And so the moral weight of a citizen of Rwanda is just the same as the moral weight of a citizen of the United States, and the President of the United States and the Congress of the United States are required to be neutrals between those two, and among other things, redistribute resources from the United States to Rwanda until the marginal dollar does just as much good for the citizen of the United States as the citizen of Rwanda. Okay, I view that as an interesting philosopher's conversation, but a total denial of the legitimate weight of particularity. The other extreme, and some versions, I regret to say, of the America First doctrine as practiced verge on this extreme, is that we were required to sacrifice exactly nothing in the name of the well-being of people who happen not to have the good fortune of being American citizens. And I view that as equally morally preposterous and unacceptable. Now, in conclusion, where does all this come to a head? Well, I was in the Clinton administration, and one of the most regrettable decisions that that administration made, and I know this, President Clinton himself has said so, is the decision not to intervene in Rwanda, to stop the genocide in Rwanda. And as we know, because the international community held back, hundreds of thousands of innocent people were slaughtered. And I think we know for sure that if we had done something, the loss of life could have been mitigated, and if we'd done it at the right time, it probably could have been prevented or nearly prevented altogether. Now, you have to look, if you're a president of the United States, talking to a Gold Star parent whose child has lost his life in an intervention in Rwanda to prevent a genocide, what do you say exactly? It's not a simple question. And I will say this. In political morality, and certainly in international political morality, numbers matter, right? If President Clinton had been assured that he could save 800,000 people at the cost of 8 American lives, I believe, and if he knew that for a fact, if he can put that in the bank, I believe that he would have done it. 80, 800, 8,000, 80,000. Yeah, I can keep on cutting the salami. Where do the interests of the people who have elected you or chosen you in some other fashion to be your leader, to represent their nation, to promote their interests, where does that trump concern for other people? I'm not going to leave you with an easy answer to that question because there isn't one. What I am saying is that nationalism, rightly understood, defends the legitimacy of limited self-preference. And it is the duty of people who lead decent countries to try to figure out what that might mean in particular cases. It's a tough question, but it doesn't mean that it's a bad question. Indeed, I think it's an inescapable question, because not to ask that question is to risk either the kind of blind risk aversion that prevented us from doing what we should have done in Rwanda, or to tell the citizens of your own country that I care about you, but not more than I care about the citizens of other countries. Try getting elected on that platform. Try governing on that platform. So nationalism, as I've defined it, I believe is our fate. It's the world's fate. And it's not an entirely bad thing that it is, but it's not an entirely good thing either. That's life. Thanks so much.